Христос Воскрес! Добрий вечір, раді вас бачити. Я зразу перейшов англійську мову. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to see you all here. I see the concentration, intelligence and beauty is unprecedented at this place. So therefore it's very nice to see you all here. And we have a special occasion. And the occasion is a meeting with our friend and colleague, might say so. Professor Tімоті Ґартон Еш has been frequently in Ukraine, but every time or every second time he comes to Ukraine, he also visits our university. And we respect it very much. I don't believe that Professor Tімоті Ґартон Еш requires some kind of the introduction. And I believe because since you're here, you already know who Professor Tімоті Ґартон Еш is. But let me just say some very personal remarks. In my belief, Professor Tімоті Еш is one of the biggest, or not, if not the biggest historian of our world. In a sense, we're living in your time, in time of Professor Tімоті Ґартон Еш. And he is not just a historian, he also a historical figure. And I bet, I'm sure that his name will be written in textbooks, so to say, in a few decades, or probably more. So let me just say that my first introduction to Professor Tімоті Ґартон Еш was through his writings, through his text. It was New York Review of Books, and started reading this in the early 90s. And this is already part of the story because basically it was a result of the personal biography of Tімоті Ґартон Еш. You may know it, that he started he has graduated from Oxford University. He's now at this university as a professor. But he started to do his dissertation on Germany, and he used to shuttle between West and Eastern Germany. And it was a pivotal time. It was 80s, end of the 80s, exactly when the communist regime was crumbling. And as a young PhD student, has a chance to meet all the figures that we know from the textbooks, like President Václav Havel. At that time, there was still not president, but just public figures, all the kind of things. And he wrote probably one of the most important book, which has us, say, in terms of the history writing, it's a Magic Lantern. It's a book which tried to conceptualize this kind of revolution, Velvet Revolution 89. It was an extremely important book. And since then, I used to follow his writings. I believe the reading of Professor Tімоті Ґартон Еш writings is a must for every one of us. And I believe for one particular reason. Because Professor Tімоті Ґартон Еш has invented a new genre of history. And I bet this credit belongs to you. And it's history of the present. Because basically we historians written history of the past. And this is a difference because what Professor Tімоті Ґартон Еш, he writes about presence, and he wants to conceptualize the present, so to say. And I believe there's something which is badly needed, especially now. Because we live in the times of chaos. For these times of the post-truth and nonsense. And this nonsense is very dangerous. Because it brings us to a depression, to loss of hope. And it is a special task or special challenge for a historian to make sense of a nonsense. It is exactly what Professor Tімоті Ґартон Еш does. He makes a sense of this nonsense, and by doing it, it provides with some kind of the possible, pragmatic, positive solution, especially now, in the time of Trump. So this is basically my personal reflection on Professor Tімоті Ґартон Еш. Just let me give a short note that his recent book, Homelands, has been translated in several dozen languages, including Ukrainian language. It has been published symbolically by the Vivat publishing house, which has been destroyed last year by the Russian rockets. And you have a chance to buy this book here. So also have a chance to sign this book afterwards. In that way, you will contribute the donation to the Vivat publishing house. But our event has also another public dimension, and this dimension we are collecting money, raise money for a military unit in which one of our faculty, Mikhailo Bobis, is now serving. We would like him to open this event, but he sent his response he cannot, because his unit is now moving to frontline, and he says it's becoming really hot. So he's writing for his excuse he could not attend, but it's still gives us a more responsibility to support a unit which is now extremely probably one of the most challenging, if I say most dangerous place on the front line. So far as I know from the statistics, our target is 180,000 гривня, 180 тисяч гривень. So far we have collected 103 гривня. So I suggest that it will be a very nice contribution to this event. It will make sense if we could raise this until this target. And you will see the QR code on the screen. So what I suggest, a very simple solution. Let everyone, I know that you already did your donation, which is, you have our respect. So my suggestion is very simple. Let's, doing this lecture, let's double it. That everyone will double this donation to meet this target. So, and now without further ado, let us meet Professor Tімоті Ґартон Еш and invite him for his floor.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and I wish I could make my own contribution while I'm giving this lecture, but even I can't multitask that much. It's wonderful to be back here again. This is the 7th time I've been in Ukraine since the beginning of the full-scale war. As I always do when I come to Lviv, I went up this afternoon to the field of Mars, and of course to see how the forest of graves and flags just grows and grows every time. The most recent grave was the 6th of May, and in particular to find again the grave of someone I had the privilege to meet. Some of you will have known Yevgen Hulevich from Lviv, who I met in December 2022 and was killed near Bakhmut just 3 weeks later. So when we talk about Ukraine and Europe alone in the world of Donald Trump, this is what it's about. It's about people fighting and dying, and I look forward to contributing to that fund myself after I finish talking. It's also wonderful to be back at UKU, I think for the 2nd or 3rd time. You are, of course, one of the 2 best universities in Ukraine, like Oxford and Cambridge in Britain. You can choose whether to be Cambridge, in which case you're the 2nd best university, or Oxford, in which case you're the best. It's also a great pleasure to do this with my good friend, Professor Yaroslav Gricak, one of the most outstanding historians of Ukraine and of contemporary Ukraine, particularly working in Ukraine today. My suggestion had been that we had a kind of conversation, but Professor Gricak said, no, you've got to give a proper lecture first. So I'm going to give some sort of a lecture, proper or improper, first, and then we'll have the conversation. And to exactly the point you just made, as a good historian's lecture should be, it's about the past, the present, and the future. Because, of course, in any period, it's an interesting question, when is the present? When does the present begin? There is one sense in which the present is just an almost invisible line, in which my introductory remarks were already the past. It's just a line between the past and the future. But for historians, there's another sense of the present, which is the period in which we are living, which is our time. And I would argue that the present, in that sense, began not just for Ukraine, but for Europe and arguably for the world on the 24th of February 2022. I think it was as important as that. And therefore we are at the beginning of a new period in European and arguably in world history. And beginnings in history, as in romance, are particularly important. It matters rather more what you do at the beginning than what you do maybe after 25 years of married life, I could perhaps suggest. And it's the same in history. So what we did in the first 5 years after 1945 basically created the international institutions, the international order, which in many respects we have to this day, 80 years later. What we did in the first 5 years after 1989 set the trajectory for the entire next period. And we are in year 4 after the beginning of this new period. Briefly on the past that is definitely past, the period covered in my book, which is really two overlapping periods. It's what I call the post-war period, the period after 1945, and what I call the post-wall period, the period after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the 9th of November 1989, which clearly started a new period. Both those periods ended together on the 24th of February 2022. So they were overlapping periods, which then ended with one crashing blow. These days, many people attempted to argue that the post-wall period, what some call the post-Cold War period, was quote-unquote a holiday from history. It was just the end of history illusion. We just slept our way through it only to wake up in 2022. I don't think that's right. Actually, that period divides rather clearly in two halves. And in the first half of that period, roughly speaking from 1989 to about somewhere between 2004 and 2007, we achieved extraordinary things. Extraordinary things. Remember that on the 10th of November 1989, Europe was still divided. The Warsaw Pact still existed. Russian troops were still in East Germany. Germany was not united. And Europe didn't even have a single market, let alone a single currency. And all the states of Central and Eastern Europe were still more or less Soviet-type states. And of course, you had not yet achieved independence. And people talk about it as if it was a period of absurd liberal self-confidence. Francis Fukuyama, end of history, we know history is going our way. Not a bit of it. Those of you who were there will remember that we had no idea how things were going to work out. No one had ever converted Soviet-type systems into liberal democratic countries. The joke at the time was, we know you can turn an aquarium into fish soup, but can you turn fish soup back into an aquarium? And actually what we did, particularly in East Central Europe in the next 15, 16, 17, 18 years, was to turn fish soup back into an aquarium. Some pretty odd kinds of aquarium, I would have to say, but nonetheless, aquaria. And at the same time, we brought most of the eastern half of Europe into the major institutions of liberal international order and the transatlantic West, namely NATO and the EU, all the way up to and including the Baltic states, which did not exist on most political maps of Europe in 1989. One of the stories I tell in the book is of being invited to brief President George W. Bush before his first official visit to Europe in 2001. And the discussion then was about NATO enlargement. And he said, but should we really include the Baltic states? So it was a question. They hadn't decided. And then we who were advising him, myself, Michael McFaul, who was subsequently the US ambassador, as you know, to Moscow, and now a great supporter of Ukraine, and others, Felix Rohatin, Lionel Barder, subsequently the editor of the Financial Times, said, absolutely, you've got to do it now. And now we have this absurd counterfactual discussion about whether it was the enlargement of NATO that was responsible for the full-scale war in Ukraine. The precise opposite is the truth. The precise opposite is the truth. Where would Estonia or Latvia, Lithuania be today if they didn't have the double security of EU and NATO? And by the way, this was also a period of extraordinary advance for liberal democracy, not just in Europe. To give you the figures, Freedom House, who have this classification of free countries, partly free, unfree countries, we can discuss how good the classification is, but according to their criteria, at the beginning of 1974, there were only 17 free countries in Europe. By 2004, there were 35. Early 1974, only 41 free countries in the world. By 2004, 89. So an unprecedented spread of liberal democracy in that 30-year period, right? Extraordinary achievement. Now, it seems to me, if I may put it this way, one of the misfortunes for Ukraine was that, as it were, the period of the self-realization and consolidation of independence and sovereignty and democracy, of making it really your own, comes at the end of this period of extraordinary advance. So whereas for a country like Poland, you were going with the tide of history, I mean, my formative experience in Ukraine was the Orange Revolution in December 2004, when I had the great pleasure of being conducted around by Kiev by Professor Grzak's son. We saw that as just the continuation of this whole series of velvet revolutions. But as you know, it was actually just at the beginning of the pushback of what one might call the anti-liberal counter-revolution, so that whereas Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia were going with the tide of history, you've since been making your revolutions, 2004, 2014, 2022, against the tide of history. Because starting in 2008, we have what I call the downward turn. And two separate but almost simultaneous crises, the beginning of the global financial crisis in summer 2008, and Vladimir Putin's seizure of two great chunks of Georgia just a couple of months later in 2008, start a cascade of mutually reinforcing crises, which goes all the way through the subsequent years, actually taking us all the way down to February 2022. Hungary already starts ceasing to be a democracy. Viktor Orban starts demolishing democracy in Hungary already in 2010. You have the refugee crisis. You have, of course, 2014, the seizure of Crimea, the beginning of the war in eastern Ukraine. You have Brexit. You have Trump #1. You have the growth of nationalist populism, Marine Le Pen in France, 2017. You have COVID, and then all the way down to the full-scale war in Ukraine, so that you have this downward turn that takes us to that moment of the 24th of February 2022 and the beginning of a new era. I'd be happy to talk about that at greater length in discussion, but it's all in the book, and I do remember that I talked about it once before here. So I'm very happy to respond to any comments or questions. So let me come to what I would argue is now the history of the present, that period that begins in 2022, which is characterized up to this point by three big shocks: the Putin shock, the Xi shock, and the Trump shock. The Putin shock, I don't need to tell you about. You know about it much better than anyone else. The full-scale invasion, the beginning of the largest war in Europe since 1945. We see its results in the field of Mars. And of course, when I say a Putin shock, there's this silly question which is asked, is it Putin's war or Russia's war? The answer is obviously both. What people often forget is what I call the Xi shock, which is that we discovered that the war, the full-scale war in Ukraine, revealed to us, was a revelation of the fact that we already live in what I'm going to call a post-Western world. What do I mean by that? I mean that we discovered that the other superpower, China is already a superpower, and the potential superpower, India, and the major regional power, Turkey, and the major powers, South Africa and Brazil, all these great and middle powers of the rest of the world were entirely happy to go on doing business with Vladimir Putin's Russia, even as he is waging a brutal neo-colonial war against Ukraine. If you doubt this, look at the photographs of all the summit meetings of organizations like the BRICS, where Vladimir Putin has been an honored guest in many parts of the world. If you doubt this, look at the opinion polling that my Oxford research project, Europe in a Changing World, conducted with the European Council of Foreign Relations. 3 major rounds of polling. You can find it on the website europeanmoments.com. europeanmoments.com. What we find is that China, India, Turkey, others, in public opinion polling, say that Russia is either an ally or a necessary partner. And the figures for ally and necessary partner combined are around the 80% mark, give or take. Sometimes a bit more, sometimes a bit less. And what is quite shocking is that those numbers in China and India have actually gone up between 2023 and 2024. So another year of this war, and the figures have gone up. And what is more, we discover that these great and middle powers of, broadly speaking, the non-Western world, between them are now rich and powerful enough pretty much to counterbalance the West, right? Partly, by the way, as a result of the US and Western-led globalization of the last 40 years. So their power, their wealth and power, is a result, in a sense, of the success of the West in that leading that globalization, because the greatest beneficiaries of globalization have been countries like China and India. And of course, that economic power has translated into international influence, political and military power. We, as we say in English, throw the kitchen sink at Russia in terms of sanctions. Sure, the sanctions were imperfect and full of holes, but it was still a very big set of sanctions. And thus far, the Russian economy, I'm sorry to say, has withstood them really quite well. And if you believe the statistics, the Russian economy grew 4.1% last year, 2024, which is better than most European economies. That's partly because it converted to a war economy, but it's also because we don't buy their oil, India buys their oil. We cut trade with Russia, China expands its trade with Russia in all the necessary technologies. So Putin shock, Xi shock, that is, we are in a post-Western world, and even if there is unity of the West, our relative power to compel Russia is significantly less than it was before. Now, if I had been giving this lecture here a year ago, I would have said the following. When I say post-Western world, I don't mean I don't think the West exists, I would have said. Because I would have said the West still exists. There is still a geopolitical actor whose core is Europe and North America, Europe and the United States. Now comes the Trump shock, the cruelest blow of all. The United States, the single power that did most to build up and consolidate and protect that liberal international order over 80 years, is now demolishing that liberal international order itself. And no one can demolish it more effectively than the United States, right? And Donald Trump have effectively changed sides. He is closer to Vladimir Putin than he is to Volodymyr Zelensky. He makes the absolutely outrageous and ridiculous and mendacious claim that Ukraine started the war, and so on and so forth. You know all this very well. And that means that the West, as a geopolitical actor, no longer exists, at least for the next 4 years. And that, for many of us, certainly for me, is a shocking statement. But it's important to face up to it. Of course, the West still exists as a historical entity, built up over 1,000 years, as a cultural entity, as a community of values and ideas and ideals. But as an effective geopolitical actor, at least for the next 4 years, it doesn't exist. And this is not just Trump. It's partly evolution of the United States as a whole, and partly the role of the individual Donald Trump. So let's not kid ourselves that after 4 years of Donald Trump, everything goes back to normal. It won't. At best, it'll be a new normal in our relationship with the United States. Hence, my title, Ukraine and Europe Alone in a Trumpian World, right? And by a Trumpian world, we mean a world of transactional great and middle powers, in which essentially the United States is behaving pretty much like any of those other great and middle powers, pursuing its national interest, or what it thinks is its national interest, without respect to long-term alliances or shared values. And so now it's over to us. It's up to us. Both, in the first place, the defense of Ukraine, and then the defense of Europe. And when I say defense, I don't just mean military defense. I mean economic, political, digital, democratic, and so on. And we are living this extraordinary period in world history. I don't know, Yaroslav, if you can think of another example of this, where almost every leader in the world has in mind as their audience one man, Donald Trump. So, okay, we'll come back to that. I hadn't thought of Donald Trump as Lenin, I must say. In a theater, you have one man delivering a soliloquy on stage and an audience of 1,000 people. In today's world, you have 1,000 political actors on stage, and the audience is one man, Donald Trump. And everyone, Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, Friedrich Merz, Donald Tusk, Volodymyr Zelensky. What is the theater that we are witnessing these days about Istanbul? Who is the audience of that theater? The audience is one man, Donald Trump. So, and I have to say, I mean, we can talk about this in discussion, but I think it's a perfectly sensible thing to do. Everyone has to try and keep Trump on board. But it's not enough, because keeping Trump on board is going to be something minimal, keeping Trump on board, right? The not total abandonment. And therefore the question is, can Europe do it on its own, sustain Ukraine on its own? Militarily, the answer, it seems to me, is yes, so long as we get a short list of absolute essentials from the United States, which only the United States has at the moment and can deliver. The intelligence, the satellites, the Patriot missile interceptors, the so-called strategic enablers. It's just a fact, because we've relied on the United States for our security for the last 80 years, we don't have that stuff. And any military expert you talk to says we will be in real difficulty if we can't get that. So in a way, the name of the Trump theater is at a minimum to keep that minimum essential support. All the rest of the stuff, given the political will, given the mobilization, Europe can do. Economically, again, Absolutely. The European economies together are something like 12 times the size of the Russian economy. But then we come to the politics, the democratic politics in our different countries. And at a time when our countries are heavily indebted, with the one exception of Germany, Germany is the only country that has the fiscal headroom to do it, but all the rest of us have debt about 100% of GDP, aging populations, huge demands on our health systems, on our welfare systems, on our pension systems, on our infrastructure, and so on. In democracies, persuading people to go on giving that level of support to Ukraine for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, which is clearly what it's going to take, it's a big ask, with all the best will in the world, which is why confiscating the Russian frozen assets is just absolutely essential. Because there you suddenly have 250 billion, give or take, of euros that you can put to this purpose without costing European taxpayers a single cent. I would also say cultural support. We're in a university here, so it'd be nice to talk a bit about culture, because one of the victory in a way you have already won is the universal cultural recognition of Ukraine as an independent, sovereign, really fascinating European country. But that too can fade if you're not careful. And so it might be interesting to talk about how one sustains the cultural interest in Ukraine. But above all, then, the question of the political, psychological sustenance of support. Now, all the EU foreign ministers in Lviv, when was it? Monday? 2 days ago? Last week. Friday, that's right. And then, of course, 9th of May. And then Starmer, Macron, Merz and Tusk in Kiev. Now, that's important, because you have the most important political leaders of Europe pinning their flag to the mast. It becomes part of their political biography, their credibility, and their self-understanding. And it wasn't self-evident. I mean, the commitment made by Merz is very different from that made by Olaf Scholz. I don't need to tell you. The Macron of today is not the Macron of 3 years ago, who still thought he could charm Vladimir Putin. Tusk has always been solid, but Starmer is also very interesting. There was nothing at all in Keir Starmer's biography to suggest he would become another great supporter of Ukraine. I know you're somewhat keen on Boris Johnson here. We're slightly less keen on Boris Johnson because he gave us Brexit. I'm not going to say there's going to be a little cake called a Keir Starmeroniuk, or like a Boris Johnsoniuk, but Starmer's commitment to it is absolutely solid, and it has cross-party support. Okay? So there is the political will at the highest levels in the right places to do this, and an understanding that you can't just do it in the EU because you have the blocking countries, like above all Viktor Orban's Hungary. But here comes the question mark. This is a matter of not of days, not of weeks, not of months, but of years. And what we have in Europe in this new period is the fact that the forces of integration and disintegration in Europe have never been more finely balanced, right? So we have very powerful forces of continued integration. The way the EU responded to the COVID crisis with Next Generation EU, unprecedented mutualized European borrowing, the way the EU and Europe has responded to the war in Ukraine. Now there is a Europe of defense, the coalitions of the willing, all the different areas of mobilization, the understanding that in response to Trump, Europe has to stand up for itself. That's the good news. The bad news is, in that period of the downward turn that I started talking about from 2008, one major member state, one of the most important countries for defense, security, and foreign policy, my own country, Britain, has left the EU, Brexit. In Hungary, you have a full member state of the EU that is no longer a democracy. Most political scientists would say it's an electoral authoritarian country, clearly pro-Putin, constantly blocking joint EU action in support of Ukraine. In Slovakia, you have Robert Fico, who on May the 9th sat on Red Square with Putin and Xi Jinping and President Lula of Brazil to endorse this grotesquely mendacious account, equating the Great Patriotic War with Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. In Romania, we are almost certain, or at least very likely, to be getting a hard-right nationalist populist leader, a president who will seriously reduce the support for Ukraine. And in Western Europe too. In the Netherlands, we have a hard-right populist party in government. In France, according to the opinion polls, the leading candidate for president was Marine Le Pen, and if it's not her, it's Jordan Bardella. In Germany, shockingly, a party that has now officially been classified as a far-right party, the AfD, with clear neo-Nazi elements, is scoring close to a quarter of the vote in recent opinion polling, fifth of the vote plus minus in actual elections, and much more than that in the Eastern Länder. There has always been an anti-liberal Europe. Yeah, it's very important to remember this. There's always been a liberal Europe and an anti-liberal Europe. You know, when we say Viktor Orban is violating European values, that's a prescriptive statement. It's a normative statement. It's a statement about the values of the EU. It's not an empirical historical question, because reactionary, nationalist, patriarchal, Christocentric values, those he represents, are historically European values. It's a great part of European history. And so this conflict between integration and disintegration is also one between, it's an old story, between liberal Europe and anti-liberal Europe. And then we have a structural problem. And the structural problem is very simple. It is that the policies we need are European, but our politics, in the sense of our politics, are still national. So, in order to hold our own as Europe, in a world of giants, we need to be a giant ourselves. So we need a European defense policy, a European economic policy, a European digital policy, a European capital market, a European democratic market, right? But our politics are still national. And therefore it's 27, 30, 35 different countries. And one or two election results can put a massive spanner in the whole works of Europe. So it's, you know, as you've seen with Hungary, so it's a big struggle. And what I want to say is that this struggle will not be decided today or tomorrow. The Zeitenwende, which Olaf Scholz talked about, is not a single moment. It's not one day or 1 month or 1 year. It's a whole period of turning. And I would say that we're likely only to know which way it's going, and therefore what is the direction for the new period towards the end of the 2020s. If the next president of France is Marine Le Pen and the AfD have won the elections in Germany in 2029 and Reform UK in Britain, and the war in Ukraine has gone badly, then it's gone one way, the other, it's gone the other. I'm going to finish up in opening the door to the conversation with Yaroslav Grycak. I'm not sure about this, so it's a question to you and to the audience, but I wonder if we could think about Ukraine also in terms of this dichotomy of integration and disintegration. I'm not absolutely sure if they're the right terms, but there's something there, because you have had this absolutely unparalleled unity in war. But one can already see, and it struck me on my last couple of visits here, and I've just been in Kiev 3 or 4 days, the potential for much more disunity and conflict in this society and in your politics, precisely when the moment, not of peace, because it's obviously not going to be peace in a meaningful sense, but say of a longer ceasefire arrives. So I'm going to put a controversial proposition on the table, and then look forward to discussing it. The most dangerous moment for Ukraine was clearly the beginning of the full-scale war. I wonder if the second most dangerous moment might not be the beginning of a so-called peace. And that's partly because it's, alas and alack, not going to be what one might call a full-scale peace, right? A full-scale peace would be you recover all your territory, Russia is defeated, pays reparations, Vladimir Putin and others, his henchmen, are in front of a tribunal in The Hague, maybe Russia's occupied by the French, the British, and the Germans to make a change. That's a full-scale. That's a full-scale peace. Okay, even if I exaggerate slightly, but if we get what you would regard rightly as a full and lasting peace, as a victory, then you have what we in Britain call V Day, Victory in Europe Day. Yep. 8th of May. It was actually the 7th of May because the surrender was signed on the 7th of May, but never mind. 8th of May. And it's a massive, fantastic celebration because we fought and we won. And, you know, it's absolutely clear. There was total surrender. The enemy was defeated. We won. And it's a celebration of national unity, and so to this day, it's this wonderful recurring festival. But unfortunately, it's quite clear that in the best case, what we're now going to get for Ukraine is going to be, to put it mildly, a whole lot more qualified than that. By the way, it didn't need to be that way. Even if we'd had a much stronger Western policy, particularly from the United States and Germany, in late 2022, early 2023, it could have been a different story. But unfortunately, you know, that door has closed. And it's precisely in these circumstances that the dangers of disunity arrive. I don't need to tell you. All the different experiences of war, those who were at the front line, those who were in the occupied territories, those who were internally displaced, those who were here all the time, those who spent the war outside the country, all those different experiences, all that trauma, all the potential for recrimination, and of course the politics when they come back. Zbigniew Brzezinski gave a lecture some years ago at the Kiev Mahila Academy, which I've now decided is the Cambridge of Ukraine. And he said, he was asked, you know, what's the greatest danger for Ukraine? And he said that you become like 18th century Poland. And you'll become the victim of your own internal divisions. So, I mean, I put it on the table that that's a real danger for us all. For all of us, not just in Ukraine, but in Europe, there is the following difficulty. When Winston Churchill received the Croix de la Libération, the Liberation Cross, from Charles de Gaulle in the 1950s, Churchill made a little speech celebrating the wartime unity of the Free French and the British fighting Nazi Germany. And then he said a very interesting thing. He said, but I have to say it's much more difficult to keep this unity and determination in conditions which are neither war nor peace, but something between war and peace. And that's where we're all going to be for many years to come. And so it's a particularly difficult challenge to keep that unity and determination and strategic direction in conditions which are neither war nor peace. In other words, what I'm trying to argue for you, and with this I finish, is that for both Europe and Ukraine, there is this ongoing struggle between the forces of integration and disintegration. And our integration and your integration and our disintegration and your disintegration are mutually dependent and mutually conditioning, right? So it's very hard to imagine a successful integration of Ukraine if you have disintegration in the rest of Europe. I think it's quite hard to imagine a successful integration of Europe if there is disintegration in Ukraine. It's all too easy to imagine disintegration reinforcing each other. This is going to be a process that will take several years to work out. I'm afraid there's not going to be a single VU Day, Victory in Ukraine Day, or VE Day. It's going to be a VU decade, or VE decade in the best case. It's about the trajectory of the country goes through this turning period rather than a single moment. And so if I say do peremochu, I mean to victory by the end of the decade. Thank you very much. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Professor Timoty Ґартон Еш, for a very inspiring talk. I'm glad I was right by suggesting give a talk instead of our discussion first. And now after our talk, I have a clear purpose in my life. For next decade, I have to exercise more and put myself on strict diet to live longer, to see the V-Day. And I wished everyone such a purpose that we have to meet better sooner than later, so to say. But thank you so much again. Let's pretend the MAGA has a point. The MAGA movement has a point. And the point is that we are living in a very dangerous world, increasingly dangerous world. And part of this danger comes that printing media has been replaced by the social media, and also introduction of artificial intelligence, which on the one hand empower every single individual, but also weaken democracy. Because now the more space for manipulation, and then giving the argument on the MAGA, since most of the people doesn't meet IQ demands, so to say, it means that decision of majority could not make sense or probably increase this kind of danger. So therefore, the point is, the conclusion is, we have to have some kind of the power of selected people, without tartan oligarchy, so to say. So, to conclude, the time of the democracy is past because of these changes. So my question is, how would you respond to this kind of argument?
So first of all, there's a lot of truth in that. All the way back to Aristotle, it's between democracy and oligarchy. And what we see in the United States at the moment looks very like oligarchy. Trump and Musk and Zuckerberg and Bezos, e tutti quanti, looks very like an oligarchy. So we, in liberal democracy, allowed that to happen. We allowed what Aristotle warned against, which is the decay of democracy into oligarchy, in these new conditions that you've just referred to. So there's a very interesting book by a colleague of mine at Stanford, my other university, called Josiah Ober, who's both an ancient historian and a political scientist. And it's about ancient Athens. And he says, there's an epistemology of democracy. Democracy depends on a certain kind of knowledge. And that knowledge is represented on the pnyx or the agora, where all the citizens get together. They're given the facts. They're given the arguments for different policies, and then they debate and they decide. And this is how the ancient Athenians decided to fight the invading Persians on sea in the Battle of Salamis rather than on land, and so save the world's first democracy. And what's happened with the digital revolution over the last 40 years is that we have lost this basic epistemology of democracy. That's to say, we've lost a shared public sphere where at least we have shared facts, even if we have different opinions. And so to go to your question about how we get it back, number one, we have to go after oligarchy. What is oligarchy? It is that the separation of wealth and power, which is the key to modern liberal democracy, is destroyed, and wealth and power become intertwined. So we have to separate wealth and power again. And secondly, we have to get back the kind of public sphere we need for democracy. Easier said than done, but I'll tell you one practical way of doing it. If you have a public service broadcaster, which is genuinely worthy of the name, which is reasonably professional, impartial, independent, and fact-checking, hang on to it for dear life, ring-fence its editorial independence, and quadruple its budget. Right? So one of the reasons Britain has come back from the craziness of Brexit is that we still have the BBC. I'm very interested that here people speak quite highly of Spільно as a public service broadcaster. So I would say hang on to it for dear life, ring-fence its independence, and quadruple its budget.
Thank you so much. By the way, I just found out, ironical fact that Spільно is founded mostly by the state. To what extent is Spільно? So this is a challenge to make Spільно really Spільно, the Republic in Ukraine. And I know they have some pressure. They told me they have some pressure from time to time from the state, from the administration, what to do, what not to do, all the kind of things. So they will have another challenge here. I know you are very well versed in the Polish history and the Polish culture, and there is a Polish saying, the Polak mądry po szkodzie. A Pole is wise after the damage. Damage first and wisdom after. And now there's a universal application because Ukraine is very much like that. I mean, everyone is like that. They have a kind of the thing. So what I'm saying here that, if this is my impression is, correct me if I'm wrong, if you look at the history of Europe, it's a history of endless calamities, damages, and crises. And this is a bad news. The good news that more often than not, every crisis ends up with a solution that works. It's working solution. It's not perfect solution, but it's working. So like we have after 30 years of war, this 17th century Westphal system. Like after the First World War, we have a kind of system of nations. Like after the Second War, we have European Union as unprecedented space of no war and liberal democracy. So my question is, wouldn't we consider this our Ukrainian war, as a kind of a chance, a crisis that Europe badly needed to shape up?
Every crisis is an opportunity. And the old saying in Washington in the financial crisis, this is a crisis too good to waste. I mean, of course you're right. And of course, you know as well as I do that throughout European history you have periods of a certain order, which is followed by a period of disorder, which then normally reemerges into a new period of order. And what was so peculiar and interesting about what happened after 1989 was that the existing order was simply extended eastward, rather than any new order being created after that moment, and which is why you get this amazing 80-year period. I think you and I as historians would like to hope that just occasionally people might learn from history. But there's rather little evidence that they do. What they
Damage
do learn...
first. Damage first.
Yeah. Well,
lesson after.
What they learn from is personal experience. That's why in the book I talk about the memory engine. There's nothing to compare with your personal. You've experienced a dictatorship, you've experienced a war, you've experienced an occupation. My God, you know about it, and it informs your behavior for life. And one way of thinking about what we have now is that because the trauma of the first half of the 20th century was so enormous, the memory engine has taken us through 80 years. It's taken us through a longer period. It's taken us through a whole human lifetime. Because even people, I mean, you know, but the Second World War was in a way an experience in my lifetime, even though I was born in 1955, because it was such a powerful experience for my father, for my parents. And so now we no longer have that memory engine in most of Europe. The tricky thing is that for most of European history, these were European orders and European disorders. And now we have this post-Western world with an entire globe of competing great and middle powers, behaving like 19th century European states or empires, plus global warming with extraordinary impacts on resources like water, pushing mass migration, plus an unprecedented technological revolution, which, for example, means that there are going to be AI weapons being developed in laboratories in China and the United States, and neither side is going to know what the other side is capable of. So you have both these sort of globalized great power competition and these new global drivers of insecurity and uncertainty. So I think we're entering a very dangerous period.
That's a good news. We have books and articles that have had a forecast of an end of the West order, at least for the last 100 years, since Spengler time. Every probably second decade, we have something that forecast that this is end of the West. I remember that since the fall of the Berlin Wall, there has been a few years, there appeared an article somewhere on my computer, I have a record to that, which is called End of the West. Because basically they were responding to Fukuyama argument. It's not end of history, it's end of the West. And the point was that once you reach a summit, the only way to proceed further is to go down. So this has been the summit, so this is decline of the West. And the thing is that let's take a worst case scenario, United States is out of the West. Could we foresee such a scenario that we may be facing a new West? Not Europe per se, as you mentioned, as a core, but also Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and Ukraine for that matter. Are we not facing not just post-West, but probably new West emerging under such circumstances?
I wrote an article 20 years ago after a visit to Canada saying I've discovered the perfect EU member state. It's Canada. Fits all the criteria, and they speak both English and French, which is ideal. And now it's becoming reality because of Trump and Mark Carney, and so suddenly we're reimagining geography is changing because suddenly Greenland is under attack, and so we as Europeans feel an obligation to defend Greenland, and just a hop and a skip from Greenland is Canada, and so we have, as it were, a northwest extension of Europe all the way to Vancouver, where my older son lives. And at the same time, the political imagination of Europe is being stretched, in a sense, if you like, to the southeast because of Ukraine. Because now Ukraine is accepted much, much more widely as undoubtedly a European country, and some even say a Central European country, and the others look to Georgia, to Caucasus to that extent. And so, yes, you suddenly have a larger Europe, and then, as you rightly say, we can think of Australia, we can think of New Zealand, we can think of Japan. The question is, to what extent can we have a powerful non-hegemonic West, right? So the awkward truth is that it worked so well in Europe because we had what the American scholar John Eikenberry called the liberal Leviathan, the United States. And they were the security hegemon, right? So it's easy enough to do non-hegemonic superpower when it's trade policy or regulation, right? Because you can have endless meetings in Brussels, and finally there's a compromise, and the Belgians get a bit, and the French get a lot, and the Italians get some, and you hammer out this compromise. That's fine. But a non-hegemonic military superpower, that's something harder to imagine, harder to do. Simple illustration. Suppose the US pretty much withdraws from NATO. So the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, the boss of NATO in Europe, Saka, is always an American. And his deputy, because I'm afraid it is a he normally, is always a Brit. And then there are various other nationalities. But suppose it's no longer an American. Who should be Saka? Anyone up for a German Saka? How would that go down? The French, of course, have a very clear answer. It obviously has to be a French Saka. That's self-evident, because France incorporates the sense of the European spirit. But just ask that simple question. Who would be the European Saka? And you see how difficult it is to do. Don't get me wrong, I think that's what we have to try to do. But doing a non-hegemonic Rzeczpospolita, Commonwealth, superpower, is something unprecedented in history.
But presumably, or let's take it that this will be kind of security union. When it will be there on the top, will be not a priority, will not be probably trade or some kind of political decisions, but first of all, security concerns.
Well, I mean, I think it'll be all of the above, because I think, and you know this very well, that in this interconnected world, security is not just about tanks and missiles. I mean, it's a much economic security, information security, when you think about digital security and so on and so forth, energy security and so on and so forth. So I think it's multidimensional, but certainly security is clearly going to be a high priority, because we are going to have to deal with a revanchist Russia trying to get its empire back for many, many years to come. Certainly as long as Vladimir Putin is in charge, but
he's relatively young.
Since he's about just only slightly older than us, I'm going to agree with that. He's relatively young. But yeah, sure. But I mean, and I think beyond that, but I mean, you've also got to deal with China, which has extraordinary ambitions towards Taiwan. So if you're going to have this new West with Japan and with Australia and New Zealand, you've also got to think about the threat from China.
Following up, this is probably a strange question, strange scenario. Would you consider this kind of rapprochement between New West and China is possible? Rapprochement. When Trump is out. When Trump is out, when Trump of America is out.
It's a really great question, and funnily enough, we just spent 3 days in Oxford discussing exactly this question, because it's on the agenda in this project on Europe in a Changing World, because for all of what I said about the ambitions towards Taiwan, China is a different kind of actor from Russia, in the sense that it knows very well that it is the greatest single beneficiary of a globalized world economic order, a free trading world, and it doesn't want to lose that. And so it does have a stake in certain aspects of liberal international order while wanting to overturn other aspects. And so the question is, can we have, as it were, a kind of one-dimensional or two-dimensional alignment with China while continuing very fierce strategic competition, not least ideologically, because it's an anti-liberal power? I think it's quite difficult to do. I think if the, as it were, the cement in this new West is going to be subscribing to certain fundamental liberal values, if you get into bed with a fundamentally, deeply, existentially anti-liberal superpower, there's some contradiction, and they might be rather, you might not sleep very comfortably.
I couldn't help but ask you the question about Germany, because Paramount, you started as a historian of Germany, and probably there's no other historians that knows Germany that well, non-German historians, so to say. And I also add that we have here in our audience Rebecca Harms, who is a leader of one of the leader of Green Party. Rebecca, could you present yourself? Let's meet Rebecca. She's here with us. She was very kind to attend this lecture, and probably also have your voice then, probably.
So I have also my problems to understand my own.
So therefore we're asking somebody who's expert on that. So Olaf Scholz promised us Zeitenwende, and he never delivered it. It was like when 1848 revolution, when Taylor says that was a turning historical point when the history fails to turn. So now we have Merz, and he seems to be very much committed to have a Zeitenwende. Could Germany be a new leader of this new West?
Emphasis on the indefinite article, a, not the. I don't think Germany can be the, but I think certainly in relation to Ukraine and European security, Merz gets it. The Greens, by the way, have a major outsized contribution in moving German public opinion, which was in a very, very different place 3.5 years ago, with this complex and contorted understanding of Frieden, of peace, which was a deep misunderstanding. So I think there has been an amazing transformation at the level of the elites and of intellectuals and of media and of politicians. But at the same time, you have a society which was so content, so satisfied with the post-war world, in a way, which it was in a way the greatest beneficiary, and is so used to such a high standard of living, and a crisis, a fundamental crisis of the German business model, because, shocking fact, the Chinese are now building better cars than the Germans, and so the world is buying Chinese cars, electric cars at least, rather than German cars. So you have a fundamental crisis, and you don't have cheap Russian energy anymore. So there's a fundamental crisis of the business model. So I think it will be an extraordinary challenge to political leadership in Germany over quite a few years to bring that society along in the direction that the elites understand they have to go, and they can only do it in a larger European context. It'll always be a group leadership.
Rebecca, would you like to comment? Please do.
What I would like to leave to you, also maybe not to answer, but to think about, because you mentioned it already kind of in your introductory speech. It's so that Merz is much more outspoken. You cannot compare his way to address the Ukrainian issue with the way Scholz did it. He's a much more convincing European in the German scenery of politics, but he is also in a very, very difficult situation politically. So his power in the Bundestag and his government is based on compromise with Social Democrats. And he came out of the elections much weaker than he expected to come out. So he was below 30%, what was a shock for his party, the CDU. And all the parties, so SPD, Greens, Liberals out of the parliament, even the left, expect Bundeskanzler Merz to win back electorate from the extreme right. They see it mostly as his task. So CDU by tradition is from the right camp, so it's their task to win back voters from the extreme right party. The extreme right party builds the successes on 3 issues. Migration, irregular migration, so kind of loss of control in this field, the war, Putin, so they benefit largely from their campaign against support of Ukraine, and then social issues. Yeah. And we will see whether the other parties can resist to call him so kind of soft extreme right, or some even say Merz is, while signaling that he will reorganize migration, that he is going into the extreme camp, into the extreme right camp. And I think he is in the same situation as Keir Starmer, or a bit similar also to Macron. Macron is not running again, but all those pro-Ukrainian, anti-Putin, pro-European leaders right now, they face similar problems by the extreme right. And it's very, very difficult to fulfill, on the one hand, the promises towards Ukraine, and on the other hand, to win back the support at home. So I have no solution for this. My solution right now is clarity, telling the truth, telling what is at stake, and hope that people will become more reasonable, but there's no guarantee that Merz can succeed with what he is promising us right now.
Can I add something to that? Because I so much agree, which is, Rebecca, you said you have no solution, but I think we know what is not the solution. Yes. And what is not the solution is just to try and imitate the hard right, copy their rhetoric. I was quite shocked the other day. Keir Starmer gave a speech about immigration, controlling immigration, which is the big issue for the populists, in which he used the phrase that Britain is becoming an island of strangers. I mean, this from a left liberal reader is really shocking. And we actually know this. I have a colleague at Oxford called Tariq Abu Chadi, who's done a lot of work which shows it simply doesn't work. Because if people hear the dog whistle from the established parties, they say, why should I have the dog whistle when I could have the real dog? And so actually the votes go to the hard right parties. What I think does work, potentially, is a twin track approach. So take migration. People genuinely worry that it's out of control, right? Kontrollverlust is the German word. That's why the Brexit slogan, take back control, was so effective, because it got exactly what people want. So you do have to persuade people that the migration is being managed, that you've got it under control. But for every sentence or paragraph you deliver doing that, you need another sentence or paragraph which says we are an aging society, we're going to have more and more pensioners, we need well-managed immigration, and hey, our societies have benefited incredibly from immigration. It's really important to say. And we in Britain just had a Prime Minister of Indian origin, Rishi Sunak. Our Foreign Minister is of Caribbean origin. The Mayor of London is called Sadiq Khan. And it works. And it actually creates great dynamism and innovation. And one of the reasons the United States is so successful is because of immigration. So I think you have to have this twin-track approach. Yes, it has to be managed, but it's a good thing and we need it. And by the way, if I may, just one more sentence. I had a very interesting seminar with the Frontier Institute in Kiev, and they have a program on demography for Ukraine. And one of the things they started talking about is maybe Ukraine needs to start thinking about an immigration policy, because clearly you're going to have a demographic problem. And so actually starting positively to think about what a positive immigration policy might be could be a good idea.
Very much so. We have some probably 20 minutes for question answers, but before we proceed, let me remind you, this is not just intellectual event, it's a fundraising event. Just remember, Michaela Bobis is now on the front line in one of the most hottest places. And this is the minimum that we can do. Just the minimum, fair minimum we can do, contribute to his military unit. So you see here, this is the QR code, so please do consider contributing to this fund. So now I suggest to open the floor.
Historical correction. In Scotland we had 4 universities for several centuries, while England had 2.
Very good.
Second correction.
You can be the St. Andrews of Ukraine.
Second correction. Scotland didn't vote for Brexit.
Well, nor did I.
Third correction, we had a Muslim First Minister, Hamza Yusuf. But seriously, thank you very much. That's a very interesting perspective. I'm not a political scientist. I'm a writer who works with culture, and I've been here to talk about the language in Scotland called Scots, but I'm clearly very interested in the parallels between Ukraine and my own country, Scotland. And I would like to say that Ukrainians are very welcome in my country, and there's a great deal of support, and they have added greatly to our culture and society. We welcome this even under the most horrible circumstances. But I have a very direct question. You talked about the Russian assets, and I've been hearing about this for 3 years. What is the problem with getting these assets released and using the money to do something with? Why is it not happening?
Well, the answer is because the argument is made that then all sovereign wealth funds, all states, would not have confidence to place their assets in other countries. So, I mean, there is a serious, a serious consideration there. But actually, we have international lawyers who've made a very, very clear case for how you can justify exceptionally doing it in this case. For example, that it is a, so to speak, down payment on reparations for the war. So it's a special case. So I could not agree more that it's what we should do. I don't know what Rebecca thinks about this, but I think that's going to be one of the decisions coming on Friedrich Merz's desk, because if Merz swung his weight behind doing it, it might actually happen. If he doesn't, it won't.
Questions? Sophia Pascal, Vice Rector.
Well, Professor, thank you very much for nice intellectual evening. I think it's important for us to know that there are people who care and who continue coming here, and thank you for many other people who joined us from other countries here. Your point on disintegration is very worrying for Ukrainians. We talk a lot about this issue, potential challenge, including in this university. So my question is, from historical point of view, what should we as Ukrainians consider for the future to make this disintegration as low as possible?
Great
Thank you.
and difficult question, and I'm kind of reluctant to sort of, be prajem to Ukraina and give direct advice to Ukraine. But let me come at this from a slightly different angle. One reason we have all these problems at the moment is because of certain fundamental failures of liberalism. Okay? One of them was neoliberalism, which has led us towards the oligarchy. Another, I have to say, is an identity politics which only addressed the disadvantages of certain groups, but not of other disadvantaged groups like white working class kids. And a third one was that in the 1990s and 2000s, and even into the 2010s, liberals, broadly speaking, spent all their time talking about the international community and Europe, and left talk of the nation to the right, certainly in Western Europe. This is not so true here, but whereas, of course, 1848 was all about liberalism and nationalism walking together. So what's so interesting about Ukraine is that in the way you took us back to 1848, to the partnership of liberalism and nationalism. Now that is potentially a great strength. And so I would think everything that has to do with civic patriotism, or if you like, liberal nationalism, strengthening the sense of what we have in common so that you can, as it were, bear the load of all those differences that are going to come, would be my very sort of modest suggestion. I was talking to a friend in Kiev who's planning something called a unity forum, right? Which is about actually sitting down and talking about what are these elements, these threads of unity that are going to keep us together and sustain us through the necessary divisions, because the divisions have to come, otherwise you're not a democracy.
Thank you so much. Jeffrey Wills.
Thank you. You mentioned that at the beginning of each new age is a 5-year period of setting precedents and institution building. So what do you see in terms of the restructuring of the European Union or something? Will we move away from a single party veto, a single member veto? Will there be new structures? How optimistic are you of changes, and how would you see those stages of new institutions in this age?
Great question. That we used to talk a lot about coalitions of the willing with a small c and a small w. What was extraordinary in Kiev was suddenly we had a whole stage with a big sign saying coalition of the willing, as if it was an institution almost, the headquarters of the coalition of the willing. So that's an acknowledgement that in one, perhaps the single most important area, defense, security, is going to have to be done differently. And even for funding, there's now a proposal by the think tank Bruegel in Brussels for something called a European defense mechanism, which is designed so from the very beginning it's semi-detached from the EU, so that countries like Ukraine and Norway and the UK can be part of it. So I think my advice would be accept the pragmatic necessity for complexity and flexibility. Don't pursue the will of the wisp of perfect constitutional unity, which, if I may say so, Rebecca, is a certain German tendency, that it's all neatly organized and structured. But rather, take the Nike motto, just do it, what works. And so I think that what you will end up in the best case is, so to speak, the Holy Roman Empire at its best. Because people always, say, oh gosh, they quote that silly Voltaire quip, neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, as if it was a failure. Actually, the Holy Roman Empire is the most successful multinational community in European history, and for hundreds of years it was highly successful. And my colleague Peter Wilson, who wrote a wonderful book about it, makes the point that the key to its success was a very strong shared central mystique. To your point, a shared mystique. The Holy Roman Empire. My God, it was holy, it was Roman, and it was an empire. And it was quite something to be crowned in Aachen and then crowned again in Rome, with extreme institutional flexibility and pragmatism. And that would be my recipe for the European Union.
Questions?
Thank you. Professor, you reminded me that many, many years ago, I was so lucky that I happened to listen to your presentation at the Columbia University in New York. It was really ages ago, and I remember not much from this presentation, but one thing was so bright that I still remember it. Part of your talk was about changing of the perception and changing of perspective. And you kind of played with two dates, 9/11, 11/9. And so how this perception changed from the fall of the Berlin Wall to what happened after the terrorist attack on the United States. I just wonder, do you have a new pair of dates for us to think about?
So I'm not sure it's going to be as neat as that, because of course what I was able to say then was the European 9/11 and the American 9/11, because they put the date the month before the day. So I don't think I'm going to manage on that. But I certainly think that 22 is going to be there in the history books. And what I very much hope is that just as we have a generation of 39ers, and a generation of 68ers, and a very clear generation of 89ers. So people like Ivan Krastev or Tim Snyder or Anne Applebaum, all of whom are our products, of course, they all came through Oxford, are 89ers. So their formative experiences, they were shaped by that year. And that's going to carry them right through their lives until they're 102. And what I hope is that we're going to see a generation of 22ers, people who are shaped by this experience. Now, I'm fairly confident that in Ukraine, correct me if I'm wrong, you've got a generation of 22ers. I think in the Baltic states, you've got a generation of 22ers. I think in Poland, you've got a generation of 22ers. But by the time you get to Germany, I'm not so sure. By the time you get to Spain or Italy or Ireland, one doesn't see it so much. And so what I would really like to see is 22 being a year like 89 and 68, and if you like 39, 45, which is shared by all Europeans.
With a sign of promises, you mean? 68, with the promises, with a good promise, but 68 and 89 was still kind of promise. So 22, maybe also time of promise. Today is a day of mystique. Talking about mystique. Today is Vyshyvanka Day. So therefore we see all of us come, most of us come in the embroidered shirt. We don't have funds enough to pay honorarium for a professor for Oxford, but we could extend our small gift, which is another Vyshyvanka. Let me thank our business school, and particularly Director Yarka Boychuk, who is very efficient in choice. This is her choice. We help her. There was intellectual discussion. That's not the kind of word thing. But basically, this is the business school and also the Шептицький Center who organized this meeting. And what we suggest, or we ask, you put your bread and short on you, and we'll have a picture. Just commemorate this day, to say, and think about the 22 generation. And then we have a task to live until the D-Day, to remember what happened today.